Reincarnation is the belief that a person's spirit or soul is reborn in a new body after death, and the following two stories are classic cases of reincarnation. Herbert. Herbert was born in 1997, and when he was 3 years old in 2000, he asked his mother during a visit to his father in Bielefeld in northwest Germany, "Where is Aunt Toni?" His mother did not know anything about an Aunt Toni, but his father said that Aunt Toni was the favourite aunt of his own father, that is, of Herbert's paternal grandfather, who died suddenly of a heart attack on March 16, 1976, at the age of 53. The aunt has been dead for a long time and died in 1969. Herbert's parents were certain that Aunt Toni had never been spoken about in the family. Herbert's father had had a very close relationship with his father and was extremely saddened when his father died at the relatively young age of 53. When Herbert was still a baby and couldn't speak, he would point to a house while walking in the town of Bielefeld and said, "There, there." It was his great-grandmother's house. Of course, they had no reason to explain this to Herbert beforehand, and he would not have understood it if they had tried to explain it to him. One day the family received photos of Herbert's grandfather's mother from relatives. The pictures showed 6 siblings aged between 14 and 18. When Herbert first saw the pictures, he looked at the photo of his grandfather's mother and said, "Look, there's my mum." Herbert was only 2 years old at the time. When Herbert was still very young, he would like to go on walks with his father, and they would look at houses that they may have wanted to buy. On one occasion, Herbert said something very unusual for a child to his father, saying, "Daddy, don't get into debt." His father wondered how his son knew what debt was and asked where he'd learned about it. Herbert replied, "From Grandpa behind the bush." The bush that he described matched the location of his grandfather's grave. When Herbert was still being pushed in the stroller, his father took him to his grandfather's grave, and when they got there, Herbert started to cry. The moment his father walked away from the grave, his son stopped crying, but when his father pushed the stroller back to the grave, he started to cry again. So his father tried again, and every time he repeated walking to the grave, he kept getting the same response. Had Herbert visited his grave in a previous life after his death and unconsciously remembered it today? When Herbert and his father last visited the cemetery, they visited his grave that was located in a family plot. On this occasion, Herbert remarked, "I've already come back and I've been dead for 20 years. Actually, Herbert's grandfather had been dead for about 23 years. When Herbert was about 3 years old, he saw a stagecoach on television with a broken wheel and said, "I remember something like that from the past." When his father asked him what he meant, it became clear that Herbert was referring to the coach's spoked wheels. During the conversation with the family, it emerged that Herbert's grandfather's grandfather used to own a ladder wagon with spoked wheels, which he used to transport pictures. On another occasion, they were playing football in the hallway when Herbert was about 4 years old. Herbert suddenly said to his father, "Do you know that I'm your father?" Naturally, his father was very surprised, but took his son's comment seriously, as he had once had 2 unusual dreams. The first dream was when his wife was pregnant with Herb and suddenly felt that he no longer had to be sad about his father's early death. In the second dream, he was told that he could now spend the money that was in his father's wallet, which he'd kept as a souvenir after his father's death. Although Herbert's father had not read any literature on reincarnation, he somehow believed reincarnation was possible. However, he was certain that he'd never discussed the subject with his son. He discussed with his wife what the son had said, but she was skeptical about the possibility of her father-in-law being reborn as her son, and found the prospect very scary. Many years before, Herbert's grandfather bought a Ford Taunus car, almost 2 years before his unexpected death. When Herbert was about 5 years old, his father suggested that he wanted to sell the old car, but Herbert claimed that it was his car. Over time, and after hearing some of the things that his son had been saying, his mother started to believe that his son could possibly be the reincarnation of his grandfather. Up until the age of 6, Herbert liked to listen to a certain song by well-known German singer Roland Kaiser. after listening to it a few times, he would make a very sad face. The song he listened to matched his grandfather's situation at the time when he found that his wife had been cheating on him and had probably only stayed in the marriage for the sake of the children. The song has somehow brought back terrible memories of which Herbert was reacting to. From the age of 10, Herbert has been an enthusiastic supporter of the Arminia Bielefeld football team, even though he had not lived in Bielefeld for the last 5 years. Since then, he has collected all the Arminia Bielefeld collectibles that decorate his room, wears the team jumper, and cries when Arminia loses. The reason for Herbert being such a fanatic of the football team was because his grandfather had been a crazy fan of the club. But Herbert's father was not a fan and at the time had grown tired of father's fanaticism. So where had Herbert got his interest in the Arminia Bielefeld football team from? Herbert's grandfather had been an engineer who was also interested in biology, mathematics, physics and chemistry, and was well versed in all of them. So as Herbert got older, it came as no surprise that he was also interested in the same subject and was also good at them. As is the case with so many children that talk about past lives, at a certain age many of them over time slowly forget and grow out of talking about their past life, and Herbert was no exception. Today Herbert no longer remembers a previous life and does not want to know anything about it. Victor Vincent. The Tlingit are indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest coast of North America and are Alaskan natives. Victor Vincent was a Tlingit fisherman and a few years before his death would regularly visit his niece, Corliss Chotkin. Corliss was a daughter of his sister Gertrude. He was very fond of his niece and was especially fond of her youngest daughter, whom he believed to be the reincarnation of his sister Gertrude, which meant that the daughter was her own grandmother, who had been Victor Vincent's sister. A year before his death, Victor said to his niece that he will return as her next son. Victor had a stutter, and he hoped that on his return he would no longer have a stutter. He then lifted his shirt and showed his niece some scars on his back, which were the result of an operation many years before. She could clearly see needle marks around the scar. Victor then pointed to another scar from an operation which he had on his nose. He told her that the scars he'd just shown her would identify him when he returned as her son. He then proceeded to tell her why he wanted to be reborn as her son. He said that if he came back as a son, he would be well looked after and that she would not go off and get drunk. 18 months after Victor's death, Corliss Chotkin gave birth to a boy who they also called Corliss. When the baby was born, they could clearly see scars on his back and nose that were identical to what his mother had been shown, and were convinced that her son was Victor Vincent reborn. When he was 13 months old, his mother tried to get him to pronounce his name Corliss, where the boy suddenly pointed to himself saying, "Me Kakoti." This had been the name of Vincent's tribe. He would then correct anyone who called him Corliss with the name Kakoti, and because he was so insistent on the matter, decided to call him by that name. One day an aunt visited and was told that her son was the reincarnation of Victor. The aunt replied with, "I know." After Victor died, he appeared to her in a dream and said that he was now incarnating in your body so that he could be your son. The mother herself had waited in vain for such a dream because it was very common in their culture that when the soul was about to be reincarnated, they would announce their arrival by appearing in a dream. When Corliss was around 2 years old, he travelled to the neighbouring seaside town with his mother, where they unexpectedly met a young woman, but before any words could be exchanged, the little boy called out her name. He was so happy that he jumped for joy and called her by her Tlingit name. It turns out that the woman had been his stepdaughter in his previous life. A short time later, the boy caught sight of a man walking amongst a group of people and pointed at him and said to his mother, "There's my son William." A year later, Mrs. Chotkin took her son along to a large gathering of Tlingit. Amongst a group of people was an elderly woman, and he said, "That's the old dame, that's my Rose." The woman he pointed to had been his previous wife, whom he used to call Old Dame when he was Victor Vincent. Over the next few years, he would recognise many of Victor's relatives and friends, calling them not only by their first names but also by the name of the tribe they belonged to. Mrs. Chotkin always liked to comb her son's hair to the back. The young boy always combed it to the front, just like his deceased great-uncle liked to do. The young child once talked about something he'd experienced as Victor, where one day he'd taken his first fishing boat out into one of the small sheltered bays when the motor on his boat suddenly failed. His boat was then tossed about amongst the waves as it had lost control. He saw a boat nearby and quickly put on a Salvation Army jacket that he fortunately had on his boat, as he feared that nobody would take any notice of a Native American waving his arms about. After getting the boat's attention, he came closer and towed him back to safety. Victor had told the story to Mrs. Chotkin many years ago, and was certain that no one could have told her son about the incident, and Victor had been a member of the Salvation Army. Victor had been a keen fisherman. He used to say that he would be happy to spend all of his life out at sea. He had also been very good at fixing boat engines and anything involving the use of his hands. Corliss had the exact same interests and skills and could not have inherited or learned any of this from his father, as he had no such skills. Corliss was also left-handed, just like Victor had been. On another occasion he said to his mother, "When the old dame and I used to visit you, we always slept in this room," and immediately pointed to the room, which was now used for other purposes. This was also correct. On many occasions he would unexpectedly remember something from his previous life as Victor Vincent, which he would tell his mother. As so often happens to reincarnated children, when he was 9 years old, his memories of his previous life began to disappear. When the renowned American-Canadian Professor Ian Stevenson interviewed the young boy at the age of 15, he was not able to remember anything from his past life. Unfortunately, if Professor Stevenson failed to meet children at an age when they still had direct access to memories of their past life, in so many cases he has only to rely on other people telling him things after the event. Most of the children who remember past lives begin to talk about these when they are about 2 years old, but around the age of 6, their memories usually begin less frequent, and by the age of 9 are often completely gone. Another interesting fact was that when Victor Vincent told his niece about his stutter and hoped that in his next life he would not have it, it just so happened that the young boy also had a stutter like him. When he was 10 years old, he started having speech therapy, which fortunately seemed to have cured him, because when Stevenson spoke with him, he no longer stuttered. Professor Stevenson always liked to inspect any birthmarks that babies were born with, and was interested in the mark on the base of the boy's nose. That was from a small operation that Victor had undergone in hospital in 1938. The mark was still visible after the operation, during which they'd removed the right tear duct. He was also intrigued by the larger mark on the boy's back, which was not typical of an unusual birthmark. It was about 2.5 centimeters long, dark in colour, slightly raised, and about 0.5 centimeters wide. Professor Stevenson wrote that along the edges of the main scar I could see small round marks on both sides. 4 of these were in a straight line along one side, like a needle wounds received during surgery. Professor Stevenson had the hospital send him a detailed account of Victor's operation, and the young boy's scar on his back perfectly matched the one Victor had been left with after his surgical operation. Is this not clear evidence of reincarnation?